I have occupied this mahogany bench for over 30 years, and in that time I've learned that courtrooms have a specific smell. Usually it's the scent of old paper, floor wax, and the cold, sharp sweat of people who know they've run out of options. But on the morning of November 12th, the air in my courtroom smelled differently. It smelled of expensive Italian leather, Creed cologne, and the kind of unearned confidence that only comes with a seven-figure inheritance. Julian Vane sat at the defense table like he was waiting for a table at a Michelin star restaurant rather than facing a felony assault charge. He was 26 years old, the only son of Marcus Vane, a man whose real estate empire owned half the skyline visible from my chamber window. Julian had a pattern of immunity written into the very marrow of his bones, a belief that consequences were administrative errors that his father's legal team could simply delete. He wore a tailored navy suit that cost more than the annual pension of the man sitting 3 rows behind him, and he looked at his gold watch every 2 minutes as if justice was an appointment he was late for. Across the aisle sat Sergeant Elias Thorne. He was 74 years old, and he stood, when he could stand, with a rigidity that 50 years of civilian life couldn't erase. He was a man of quiet dignity, the kind of man who had earned his place in the world through blood and mud in the Iadrang Valley. On his lap sat a faded garrison cap, and resting against his right leg was a specialized carbon fiber cane. He didn't look at his watch. He didn't look at the cameras. He just looked straight ahead with eyes that had seen things Julian Vane couldn't even imagine in his worst nightmares. The case file on my desk was heavy, not just with evidence, but with a moral weight that made my coffee feel bitter in my mouth. It started on Veterans Day morning in the quietest corner of Westside Park. It started with a red Ferrari moving at a speed that ignored the safety of families and ended with a Purple Heart recipient lying on the asphalt, while a young man laughed at his inability to keep up with the world. If you think this is just another story about a rich kid getting a slap on the wrist, I am telling you right now, stay in your seat. Because what happened when I asked Julian Vane to look at the man he called obsolete is something that changed the legal history of this city forever. The incident happened at 8:14 a.m. on November 11th, Veterans Day. While the rest of the city was preparing to line the streets for the parade, Elias Thorne was doing what he had done every morning for 30 years, walking his aging golden retriever, Jasper, through the north corridor of the park. Elias moved with a rhythmic hitch in his step, a permanent souvenir from a piece of shrapnel he'd caught near Da Nang in 1970. To Elias, that park was a sanctuary of silence, a place where the ghosts of the jungle couldn't find him. But that morning, the silence was shattered by the high-pitched mechanical scream of a 700-horsepower engine. Julian Vane's Ferrari 812. Superfast wasn't just a car. It was a $400,000 middle finger to the rules of the road. Witnesses described it as a red blur tearing through a pedestrian zone at nearly 60 miles per hour. Julian wasn't racing to save a life or heading to an emergency. He was simply bored, driving with one hand on the wheel and the other scrolling through a social media feed that valued likes over lives. He didn't see the world outside his windshield as a community. He saw it as an obstacle course designed for his amusement. When Elias saw the car barreling toward the bend where a group of school children usually gathered for their morning run, he didn't freeze. Instinct, honed by years of leading men through the dark, took over. He stepped toward the curb and raised his hand, the universal signal for stop. It wasn't an act of aggression, it was an act of protection. He was trying to slow down a disaster before it happened. But Julian Vane didn't see a protector. He saw a decrepit old man in a worn-out military jacket trying to tell him what to do. And Julian Vane had never, in 26 years, been told what to do. The screech of the carbon ceramic brakes was deafening. The Ferrari stopped inches from Elias's knees. For a second, there was a heavy, suffocating silence. Then the butterfly door swung open. Julian stepped out, his eyes hidden behind $500 sunglasses, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated contempt. He didn't ask if Elias was okay. He didn't apologize for nearly killing a man and his dog. Instead, he walked directly into Elias's personal space, his chest puffed out with the borrowed authority of his father's bank account. "Do you have any idea how much those tires cost?" he spat, the words dripping with a venom that made the air turn cold. "Get your prehistoric ass off my road before I make you regret breathing." Elias Thorne stood his ground. He didn't flinch. He had stared down North Vietnamese regulars in the tall grass. A spoiled boy in a designer suit wasn't going to make him blink. "Son," Elias said, his voice like gravel grinding on stone, "there are families here. Slow down." That was Julian's breaking point. The idea that this nobody dared to call him son and give him an order was an insult Julian couldn't process. He reached out and shoved Elias Thorne with every ounce of his youthful, misguided rage. Elias, with his bad hip and 74 years of wear, didn't stand a chance. He hit the concrete with a sound that witnesses said they would never forget, the sound of a hero's bones snapping under the weight of a coward's ego. Julian Vane sat at the defense table, playing a role he had never been forced to learn until now, the role of the penitent. His father's high-priced image consultants must have spent 48 hours straight teaching him how to bow his head, how to keep his spine curved in mock humility, and how to maintain a facial expression that suggested deep reflection rather than deep boredom. He wore a crisp white shirt buttoned to the very top, an amateurish attempt to hide the tattoos on his collarbone, marks of a lifestyle fueled by adrenaline and zero accountability. But to me, after 30 years of peeling back the layers of human deception, the cracks in his facade were glowing like neon signs. Julian wasn't sorry for shattering a man's life. He was merely irritated that his morning was being wasted in a room that smelled of old wood and consequence instead of on the deck of a Mediterranean yacht. Next to him sat Graham Sterling, a defense attorney whose hourly rate could sustain a middle-class family for an entire year. Sterling wasn't just a lawyer, he was a cleaner. He stood up, adjusting his silk Hermes tie with a slow, predatory authority. Sterling's physiognomy was a masterclass in calculated aggression. Eyes as sharp as a hawk's that never stopped scanning my face for a weakness, and thin, bloodless lips pressed into a line that suggested he could cut through the truth like a surgical blade. He began to pour words into the courtroom that were as smooth as oil and twice as slippery. "Your Honor," Sterling began, his voice vibrating with a practiced, artificial warmth, "my client is a young man with a brilliant future, a pillar of his family's multi-billion-dollar charitable empire. What occurred in that park was not an attack, but a tragic chain of misunderstandings, a defensive reaction to a high-stress, unpredictable encounter." "A defensive reaction?" I repeated, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. I felt a surge of cold lightning run down my spine, but I kept my face as still as a frozen lake. I looked down at Elias Thorne. He sat there in the front row, his aged, weathered hands gripping his carbon fiber cane so hard his knuckles were white. His eyes didn't blink, they were fixed on the middle distance, perhaps seeing the ghosts of a jungle Julian Vane wouldn't last 5 minutes in. In the gallery behind him, I saw the sharp, silent silhouettes of the Marine Corps League. Their silence wasn't an act of submission. It was the heavy silence of a gathering storm. They had bled in foreign dirt so that Julian Vane could have the luxury of standing in this room, and now they were being forced to listen to the man who assaulted their brother be described as a victim of circumstance. Sterling didn't stop. He pushed the victim-blaming strategy with a shamelessness that made the air in the room feel thin. He projected photos of the Ferrari's scuffed bumper onto the overhead monitors, as if a scratch on an Italian paint job was equivalent to the shattered pelvis of a 74-year-old hero. My client felt physically threatened when an individual approached his vehicle with an aggressive stance and a cane that could easily be utilized as a lethal weapon. Julian was simply exercising his right to protect his property and his person, Sterling said, a faint, condescending smirk playing on his lips. He was attempting to transform Elias, a man who had spent his youth protecting the very ground Julian walked on, into a common street aggressor. I locked eyes with Julian Vane. For a split second, he let his guard down. He glanced at the gallery, and allowed a micro expression of pure, unearned triumph to flicker across his face. It was the smirk of a man who believed that everything in this world, including the law, came with a price tag. He thought his father's political reach had already scripted the ending of this trial. He had no idea that in Simpson's courtroom, money can buy the most expensive liars in the world, but it never, ever buys the truth. I reached for the digital evidence tablet on my bench. That was the moment I opened the second video file. The one lawyer Sterling's private investigators were certain had been erased from the park's cloud server forever. The courtroom held its breath as I tapped the play button on the console. Graham Sterling, the $1 million cleaner, shifted his weight, his sharp eyes darting toward his client. Julian Vane had spent the last hour leaning back, his body language screaming that this was all beneath him. But as the high-definition footage flickered onto the 60-inch monitors mounted on the walls, his posture began to wither. This wasn't the grainy, distant park security footage Sterling had spent thousands trying to discredit. This was something else. This was a 4K dashcam recording from a car parked exactly 12 feet from the confrontation, a piece of evidence Julian's father's investigators had tried to buy into silence, not realizing the owner was a retired police officer who didn't take bribes. The audio was the first thing that hit us. It was visceral. The scream of the Ferrari's tires sounded like a wounded animal, followed by a silence so heavy you could hear the wind in the trees. Then came Julian's voice. It wasn't the voice of a threatened young man, his attorney had described. It was the high-pitched nasal whine of a predator who found his prey inconvenient. "Do you see this car, you old fossil?" Julian's voice boomed through the courtroom speakers, dripping with a degree of hatred that made the court reporter pause mid-stroke. "This machine is worth more than the dirt you're standing on. It's worth more than your entire miserable life." On the screen, we saw Elias Thorne. He didn't move. He stood there with his Purple Heart pride, his hand raised not as a weapon, but as a shield for the families behind him. Then came the shove. In high definition, you could see the exact moment Julian's hand made contact with Elias's chest. It wasn't a defensive reaction. It was a calculated, forceful strike. But the video didn't stop when Elias hit the ground. That's when the true secret of Julian Vane was revealed. As Elias lay there, his face contorted in a silent scream of agony as his hip shattered, Julian didn't look shocked. He didn't look scared. He stood over the veteran, adjusted his $500 sunglasses, and spat on the ground next to Elias's head. "Stay down," Julian sneered. "The world doesn't have room for relics like you anymore. You're obsolete." Julian then walked back to his Ferrari, checked the hood for scratches, and drove away. The engine's roar drowning out the sound of Elias's dog Jasper, whimpering over his fallen master. When the monitors went black, the silence in the courtroom was no longer just respectful. It was lethal. I looked at Julian Vane. The penitent mask had shattered. His face was no longer composed. It was pale, the skin around his jaw tight and gray, what we call the pallor of the unmasked. He looked at Sterling, his eyes wide with a desperate, silent question. How much more money will it take to make this go away? But for the first time, Sterling didn't have an answer. He sat down slowly, his silk tie suddenly looking like a noose. I turned my gaze to the back of the room. A tall man in a charcoal suit stood up. It was Marcus Vane, the billionaire father. Our eyes locked. In his expression, I didn't see the usual fire of a man used to winning. I saw a different kind of numbness, the realization that his billions had finally hit a wall they couldn't break through. He looked at his son, not with love, but with the cold calculation of a businessman looking at a toxic asset. The Simpson effect was beginning to take hold. I reached for my gavel, not to end the session, but to signal that the real trial, the one Julian Vane wasn't prepared for, was about to begin. The silence that followed the dash cam footage wasn't empty. It was heavy, like the air before a devastating landslide. In my 30 years on this bench, I have seen men realize they are going to prison, but I have rarely seen a man realize he is small. Julian Vane was vibrating. The predatory confidence that had filled his tailored suit just an hour ago had evaporated, leaving behind a terrified boy who looked like he was drowning in shallow water. I watched the sweat pool at his temples, soaking into the hair that had been perfectly styled by a professional that morning. His pupils were dilated, the physiognomy of the trapped, as he looked around the room for a door that wasn't there. Graham Sterling, the $1 million cleaner, finally found his voice, but it was no longer smooth. It was thin, brittle, like dry parchment. Your Honor, he stammered, his hands fumbling with his expensive leather briefcase, we recognize that the footage is distressing. However, we would like to propose an immediate stay of proceedings. My client is prepared to offer an unprecedented financial settlement, $10 million to be paid directly to Mr. Thorne's medical trust and a veterans charity of his choosing. We believe this is the most productive way to resolve this matter. The gallery of veterans in the back didn't make a sound, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sterling was trying to do what the Vanes had always done, treat a moral atrocity like a business negotiation. He thought he could put a price tag on Elias Thorne's dignity. He thought he could buy the spit off the ground. I leaned forward, my shadow falling over the defense table. I didn't reach for my gavel. I didn't need it. Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice low and vibrating with a coldness that made Julian flinch. Take a good look around this room. Do you see a cash register? Do you see a price list hanging on these walls? This is a court of law, not a private equity auction. In this room, the currency is accountability, and Julian Vane is currently bankrupt. I turned my gaze to Marcus Vane. The billionaire was still standing. He looked at his son, and for a fleeting second, I saw the mask of the tycoon slip. I saw the architectural arrogance of his life crumble. He didn't look at Sterling to save the day. Instead, he took 2 steps forward, his heavy shoes echoing like a heartbeat. The courtroom held its breath. Julian looked at his father, a flash of relief crossing his face. He expected the rescue. He expected his father to roar, to threaten, to call a senator, to fix it. But Marcus Vane didn't look at Julian. He looked at Elias Thorne. He looked at the man his son had called obsolete, the man who had sat through the insults with the stillness of a mountain. Marcus cleared his throat, a sound that seemed to cost him more than $1 billion deal. Your Honor, Marcus said, his voice raw, I have spent 26 years building a world where my son never had to feel the wind. I thought I was protecting him. But watching that video, I realized I wasn't his father. I was his accomplice. I sat in the 4th row today to watch a trial, but I ended up watching the monster I helped create. Julian's jaw dropped. His last line of defense, the Vane immunity, had just been severed by the man who built it. He reached out to grab his father's sleeve, but Marcus pulled away, his eyes fixed on me. I am not here to ask for mercy, Marcus whispered, the words shaking. I am here to ask for justice, because if Julian doesn't learn what it means to be a man today, he never will. I looked at the clock. It was 11:11 a.m., Veterans Day. The irony was a physical weight in the room. I picked up my pen and began to write the first lines of the most unconventional sentence I had ever delivered. I wasn't just going to punish Julian Vane, I was going to reconstruct him. The nib of my fountain pen scratched against the legal pad with a sound like a distant guillotine. I didn't look up until the final period was inked. When I did, I met the eyes of the 100 veterans in the gallery. I saw the quiet fire in their gaze, the look of men who had waited a lifetime for the world to acknowledge that their sacrifice wasn't a transaction. Then I turned to Julian Vane. He was slumped now, his expensive navy suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big for him. His skin had taken on a gray, translucent quality, the physiognomy of the condemned, as he realized that his father's silence was a permanent wall. I picked up the gavel, but I didn't strike it yet. I held it in midair, a 5-pound piece of wood that represented the collective conscience of 1,000 years of law. Mr. Vane, I began, my voice amplified by the deathly hush of the room. You have spent 26 years convinced that the world is a stage, and you are the only one with a script. You looked at Sergeant Elias Thorne, a man who carries more honor in his shattered hip than you have in your entire bloodline, and you called him obsolete. You thought you could spit on the ground and let your father's accountants mop it up with a check. I leaned forward, the light from the tall windows catching the silver in my hair. Your attorney proposed a $10 million settlement. He thinks that justice is a commodity. He is wrong. In this courtroom, we do not trade in gold. We trade in time and truth. Therefore, I am rejecting the settlement in its entirety. You cannot buy your way out of the dirt you created. Julian's breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound of a bird hitting a window. Here is your sentence, I said, the words falling like stones into a deep well. Julian Vane, on the charge of felony assault and battery, I find you guilty. You are hereby sentenced to 365 days in the county correctional facility. But, I paused, letting the word hang in the air like a predator, I am suspending that sentence on one condition. You will not be going to a white-collar camp. You will not be spending your days in a library. Instead, you will report tomorrow morning at 05 a.m. to the Westside Veterans Rehabilitation Center. For the next 12 months, you will serve as a direct care orderly. You will scrub the floors that these men walk on. You will empty the bedpans of the men you called relics. You will sit for 4 hours every evening and listen to their stories, not as a patron, but as a servant. You will learn the name of every man in that facility who served in Southeast Asia. You will write a 10-page biography for each of them, detailing the price they paid for your right to drive a Ferrari. Julian's eyes went wide, darting toward Graham Sterling, but the lawyer was looking at his shoes. The $1 million cleaner had run out of soap. Furthermore, I continued, you will surrender your driver's license for the duration of your service. You will take the city bus to the center every morning. If you are 1 minute late, if you show one hint of the arrogance I saw in that video, or if you use 1 cent of your father's money to ease your burden, the suspension is revoked. You will go directly to a maximum security cell to serve your year in full. And Marcus Vane, I looked at the father, you will sign a sworn affidavit that you will provide 0 financial or legal assistance to your son for the next 365 days. You wanted him to learn to be a man. This is where it starts. I brought the gavel down. Crack! The sound echoed through the high ceilings, a final, unambiguous punctuation mark on the life Julian Vane used to know. The veteran stood up in a single, synchronized motion, a silent salute not to me, but to the return of balance. Julian Vane collapsed into his chair, his head in his hands, finally realizing that the reconstruction I promised was going to be the most painful thing he had ever endured. But as I looked at Elias Thorne, I saw a faint, tired smile on his weathered face. He wasn't obsolete. He was finally, truly seen. 4 months after the gavel fell, I sat in my chambers and opened a progress report from the director of the Westside Veterans Center. In my career, these reports are usually filled with administrative box ticking, but this one felt different. It was thick, stained with coffee, and accompanied by a series of handwritten logs. I leaned back, looking out at the city skyline, and realized that for Julian Vane, the world had finally stopped spinning around his thumb. The report described Julian's first day. He had arrived at 04:50 a.m., stepping off the city bus into a pre-dawn rain that ruined his suede loafers. He had stood at the entrance, shivering, looking for a valet that wasn't there. He was no longer the prince of the skyline. To the staff and the veterans, he was simply Orderly Vane, the kid who owed a debt that money couldn't pay. The initial weeks were a war of the ego. Julian had tried to bribe a senior nurse to let him sit in the office. She had handed him a mop and pointed toward a hallway where a veteran had just spilled his breakfast. He had tried to complain about the stagnant air and the unpleasant odors, only to be silenced by a double amputee who told him, "Son, I lived in a hole in the ground for 6 months so you could have the right to complain. Now clean the floor." But the real Simpson effect happened in the 3rd month. The report noted a specific incident involving room 302, the room belonging to Sergeant Elias Thorne. Per the conditions of the sentence, Julian had to assist in Elias's physical therapy 3 times a week. I looked at the logs Julian had written, the biographies I had commanded him to produce. The first few entries were shallow, one-pagers filled with resentment. But by the 8th week, the handwriting changed. It became cramped, hurried, as if the words were pouring out of him faster than he could record them. Julian wasn't just emptying bedpans anymore. He was listening. He was hearing about the nights in the jungle where Elias had held the hand of a dying 19-year-old. He was hearing about the letters home that were never sent because the ink was washed away by rain and blood. He was hearing about the phantom pains that had haunted Elias for 50 years, pains that Julian's Ferrari-fueled rage had reignited. I saw the physiognomy of change in the photos attached to the file. Julian's face, once bloated with the soft, pale indulgence of the ultra-wealthy, had hardened. There were dark circles under his eyes, the shadows of empathy. His hands, once manicured and soft, were now calloused and stained with industrial soap. He didn't look like a billionaire's son anymore. He looked like a man who had finally realized that his life was a thin, fragile sheet of glass held up by the strength of men like Thorne. The most striking part of the report was a note from the night shift supervisor. She wrote that at 2:00 a.m. on a Tuesday, she found Julian sitting on the floor outside Elias's room. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't looking at his watch. He was simply sitting there, his head in his hands, weeping. When she asked him what was wrong, Julian didn't mention the bus ride or the hard work. He looked up at her, his eyes raw, and said, "He forgave me today. I told him I wasn't worth it, and he just reached out, touched my arm, and told me that every man is worth a second chance if he's willing to earn it." Julian Vane was no longer managing a situation. He was experiencing a soul-level demolition. The golden cage had been dismantled from the inside out. I closed the file and looked at my calendar. The final compliance review was only 8 weeks away. The world was waiting to see if the billionaire's son would revert to his old self once the license was returned. But I knew something the public didn't. You can't unsee the truth once it's been paid for in tears. 12 months to the day after the Ferrari's tires screamed in Westside Park, the heavy oak doors of my courtroom swung open for the final time in the matter of Julian Vane. The room was packed. The reporters were there, looking for a scandal. The Vane Group's PR team was there, looking for a win. But I only had eyes for two people. Julian Vane walked down the center aisle alone. He didn't arrive in a limousine, and he didn't have a $1 million cleaner walking 3 inches ahead of him. He was wearing a simple, off-the-rack gray suit, but it was the physiognomy of the man that stopped the room's breath. The boy who had walked in a year ago with a puffed chest and a hollow smirk was gone. In his place stood a man whose shoulders were set with a new kind of gravity. His hands, once soft and expressive of nothing but leisure, were now calloused. The physical map of a year spent scrubbing floors and lifting the weight of fallen heroes. Most importantly, his eyes were steady. They no longer searched the room for an escape. They searched for the truth. He took his place at the podium. Behind him, in the front row, sat Sergeant Elias Thorne. Elias wasn't using the carbon fiber cane today. He was standing, leaning slightly on his grandson's arm, wearing his full Marine Corps dress blues. The silence in the room was absolute, a reverent vacuum. "Mr. Vane," I said, my voice echoing off the high marble walls, "you have completed 365 days of service. You have written 142 biographies of men you once called obsolete. You have traveled 4,000 miles on a city bus. The floor is yours." Julian didn't look at the cameras. He turned toward Elias Thorne. He didn't pull out a pre-written statement reviewed by attorneys. He simply spoke from the cracked vessel of his heart. "Sergeant Thorne," Julian began, his voice raw but unwavering, "a year ago, I told you the world had no room for relics. I was wrong. I was the relic. I was a hollow shell held together by my father's bank account. You didn't just survive the jungle. You survived me. And in doing so, you taught me that the only thing obsolete in this world is a man without a purpose." Julian then reached into his pocket and pulled out a check. "This is not my father's money," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I sold the Ferrari. I sold my watch collection. This check covers the endowment for the Thorne Veteran Housing Fund. I earned this by letting go of the things I thought defined me." I looked at Marcus Vane in the fourth row. The billionaire wasn't looking at his phone. Tears were streaming down his face, the physiognomy of a father who had finally realized that the hardest choice he ever made was the only one that mattered. He had lost his heir, but he had found his son. I leaned forward, the gavel resting in my palm. Julian Vane, I said, the law exists to punish, but justice exists to restore. You have moved from a place of privilege to a place of service. You have learned that a Purple Heart is worth more than a Porsche, and that a man's name is only as good as the dirt he's willing to wash off another man's feet. Your sentence is officially discharged. You are a free man. I brought the gavel down for the last time. Crack. But as the room cleared, I stayed on the bench. I watched Julian walk over to Elias Thorne. The two men, one who had seen the end of the world in 1970 and one who had just discovered the beginning of his own, shook hands. It wasn't a PR stunt. It was a covenant of respect. As I watched them walk out of the doors together, I realized that my 40 years on this bench were all leading to this moment. Justice isn't about the bars on a cell. It's about the reconstruction of the soul. The Simpson effect isn't about the power of the gavel. It's about the power of the truth to silence the room and change a life forever.